everyone, and welcome to Insights. In our last episode, we talked about how Hinduism can be still greater, and Rajesh told us about how India is a land of great wisdom and there are so many gurus that people are drawn to. So today, we are going to talk about some of India's contemporary gurus.
Thanks, Ananya. It's good to be with you back again. But I think before we go to speak of the gurus themselves, I'd like to mention three great contributions that ancient India has made to the modern world.
So let me guess, Rajesh. The first of these is yoga.
Wonderful. You're right, Ananya. The first contribution is yoga. In the modern world, you have the gym, you have all kinds of contraptions, treadmill, running machine, weights. But ancient India invented something that you could use to keep healthy, you could use to connect with your inner self, and all you needed was Mother Earth. Today you have a yoga mat. I mean, you can buy a yoga mat on Amazon.com and use it. It's more comfortable. But you don't even need that. You don't need anything. It's such a wonderful thing. And it existed all these thousands of years ago before this new technology arrived. Now we have International Yoga Day. The UN celebrates it. In India also there's a revival. It's unfortunate that we lost faith in our own indigenous systems, and yoga became popular in the West and then it came back to India. But there's a revival. It's a great contribution to the modern world.
And the second great gift that India has given to the world?
The second gift is Ayurveda. Ayurveda is this ancient medicinal system which is a great alternative to allopathy, the dominant Western industrial medical system that exists in the world. The problem with allopathy is that sometimes the medicines will kill you before the disease. Because in allopathy, you have lots of side effects. Allopathy is a wonderful medical system, but many of the medicines, they have lots of side effects. Even the antibiotics, they drain you. Speaking for myself, for the last 15 years, I haven't used antibiotics as far as flu is concerned, cough and cold is concerned. I just use Ayurveda and it works for me. 15 years is a long time. I won't say that Ayurveda is a one-stop medical treatment. For many things you need allopathy, but it posits a great alternative to allopathy. And I believe in the future, we will have MBBS courses in the world which will teach a kind of integrated medical system. So you'll have allopathy, you'll have homeopathy, you'll have Ayurveda. Certainly, Ayurveda is a great contribution to the world.
And India's third gift to the world?
The third gift is probably, Ananya, the most important gift, more important than Ayurveda, more important than yoga, and that is the gift of meditation. If you see the Judaic Trinity, that is Judaism, Islam, Christianity, there is practically no mention of meditation. Some of them might mention meditation, but just in passing. There will be Christian mystics, there is Sufism within Islam, and the Jews also have some reference to meditation, but it's a passing reference. Whereas in the East, there is not a single religion in the East which doesn't mention the great importance of meditation. Be it Hinduism, be it Buddhism, be it Jainism, be it Sikhism, everybody says meditation is so important to connect to yourself and to connect to the divine spirit. So I would say this is possibly ancient India's greatest contribution to the modern world, the science and the art of meditation.
So shall we now talk about India's modern gurus who have popularized these things?
Yes, Ananya, but before that I'd like to just preface my comments by once again mentioning that while credit goes to the individual gurus who have popularized these things, but the credit really goes to the land where these gurus have come from. The credit goes to this civilization, this ancient Hindu civilization, which has given such wonderful things to the world. And Westerners who get interested in the Indian contributions, they can be attached to a particular guru. There is nothing wrong with that. Many people are devotees of Osho, many are devotees of Sadhguru, many believe that Mahesh Yogi is the greatest guru of all of them. But they should consider that connecting with the Hindu traditions also, because all these gurus are, they're making contributions because of where they come from. So it's not a coincidence that you find so many gurus in India, because it's a land which is, has such so many vibrations, so much divine energy, that these gurus are coming forward. If people want to become foreigners, if they want to become Hindus, to connect more deeply, we should welcome them. I'm not saying that we should do missionary activity. I mentioned that in an earlier talk, that missionary activity, you're trying to manipulate people's minds. But if people see something and they want to join the Hindu fold, we should welcome them.
Okay, Rajesh, who are these modern age gurus that you speak of?
Well, there is of course the great Vivekanand, and there is also Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore. But today I don't think we can talk about them. We'll talk about people who are there, the gurus who are there in post-independence India. So Vivekanand and Tagore are essentially pre-independence, you could say, although Tagore survived independence. So we won't talk about them.
So Osho and Sadhguru?
Yes. Before them, before Osho and Sadhguru, there was also Mahesh Yogi. So we can talk a bit about Mahesh Yogi as well. And I think we can speak about Sri Sri Ravi Shankar also. So let's talk about four gurus today: Osho, Sadhguru, Mahesh Yogi, and Sri Sri Ravi Shankar.
And what about Jiddu Krishnamurti?
Well, there are, so many other gurus, and some of them may be even more, elevated than the gurus whom we are discussing today. I don't want to get into that. So there are many great gurus such as S.N. Goenka, there is Jiddu Krishnamurti, there is Raman Maharishi, there is Dr. M, and there are others. But if we start discussing all the gurus, then I think we'll have to stay overnight over here. So let's keep our discussion confined to just four globally significant gurus, and we can talk about their contributions.
So are we going to talk about only the contribution of these four gurus, or also their flaws and weaknesses?
I think we can divide our discussion into pluses and minuses. I can even give them a scorecard.
Okay, that's interesting. So what score would you give them?
Well, I would give them all, you can say roughly between 65 to 70 out of 100. This is because they have their flaws, they have great contributions as well. I think it's important to talk of weaknesses for one reason, and that is that in India we haven't developed a sufficient critical consciousness. We need to be critically examined. If anybody who is a seeker for truth, he has to examine things critically. So we have a lot of tradition. Our poets say, Kabir says, Guru Kumar Shish Kumbh hai. You have Rahim who says the Guru is, someone who has to be greatly respected. Respect them, but keep your critical thinking, because I don't accept that you should just, elevate a Guru to demigod status. These days there's so much fakery around. So maybe in the ancient times there were better gurus and there was less fakery. But now you have all these fake gurus, these people who are just trying to make money, who have nothing to contribute. So it's good to have a critical consciousness even for this reason. Gurus may not even be elevated, may be even subhuman.
Subhuman?
Yeah, see the case of alleged rapist Asaram Bapu, who is languishing in jail, accused of rape. See the case of Nityanand, also accused of rape, I believe, who's fled the country, who's now in some island in South America. Or see the case of Ram Rahim from northern Punjab, who is also in jail, so also accused of rape. So these are examples of some of the examples of the many fake gurus that exist in India. But let's not throw the child out with the dirty bathwater. Just because they are fake gurus doesn't mean that the gurus don't have, that they are genuine gurus who have a great contribution to make, and gurus who've made a great contribution. But because of the presence of all these fake gurus, it's very, very important to keep your critical mind on.
So we should keep our critical thinking hats on because of these fake gurus.
We should keep a critical hat on because of the fake gurus, but also with respect to the real gurus. Because even real gurus can make mistakes. Don't expect that they will just speak the unadulterated. Don't expect that they will speak just the unadulterated, unvarnished truth. Because real gurus can also make mistakes. Everybody can make mistakes. We are all human at the end of the day. So, just because a guru is giving you gyan most of the time, or he's saying profound things, doesn't mean that he cannot make mistakes. So, keep your critical mind open. Do not surrender. If you have to surrender, surrender only to the divine. Don't surrender to gurus. Anything less than the divine is not worthy of surrender. Even if a guru tells you, surrender to me, don't surrender. Keep your mind on, because, the mind is the window to the divine, in a sense.
So shall we start with Mahesh Yogi?
Possibly yes, because in terms of seniority, Mahesh Yogi is the senior most of the 4 gurus we are discussing today. So he had many contributions. 2 of the important contributions which Mahesh Yogi made, one was Ayurveda. He popularized it in the West, and then it became popular in India also on the rebound. Of course, Ayurveda has existed here for thousands of years. But in India, we always need the West to rubber stamp something before we acknowledge it ourselves. So that was one of his great contributions. And secondly, he devised a great meditation technique. Well, great in inverted commas, but he devised a simple meditation technique known as transcendental meditation. It became very popular in the West. Now, you can argue whether it's a great meditation technique or not. But the fact is that he took the idea of meditation to the West, and he deserves plaudits for that.
Okay, so how did he manage to gain such influence in the West?
Well, he had a reasonably large following to begin with, but then the Beatles came under his influence. Today there's a much talk about influencers. People are paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, dollars to influence. But the Beatles were the biggest global influencer of their time. They were the biggest brand name. They created a sensation across the world. They took the West and the East by storm. Everybody loved their music. The Beatles fell under the influence of Mahesh Yogi. They were very attracted to the East. George Harrison even, sang devotional songs in praise of Lord Krishna. And so they were attracted to Eastern things, and many of them, they came to Mahesh Yogi. Later on, there was some element of disillusionment. For example, Paul McCartney even composed a song, Fool on the Hill, which spoke about his disillusionment with Mahesh Yogi. Mia Farrow, the Hollywood actress, she also made allegations against Mahesh Yogi, even if they were not substantiated. But for a long time, the Beatles were under his influence. They were drawn to many Eastern things, like sitar playing, Ravi Shankar, and their endorsement of Mahesh Yogi made Mahesh Yogi a superstar. So, having the biggest influencer of that time to endorse you, I think that is what set Mahesh Yogi's international trajectory on a steep graph.
But paradoxically enough, Mahesh Yogi did not have that much following in India.
That is true. But today one of his disciples commands great influence in India. That is Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. Great gurus sometimes leave behind great disciples. or important disciples. And Sri Sri Ravi Shankar used to be a disciple of Mahesh Yogi. There's another prominent gentleman I should mention, and that is Deepak Chopra. Deepak Chopra was also Mahesh Yogi's representative in the US, in a way of speaking, and he was a qualified doctor. Now he's also a great spiritual guru in a way. He's written lots of books, he gives talks, he has many celebrities coming to him for advice.
Deepak Chopra also? Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that they were Mahesh Yogi's disciples.
Well, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar and Deepak Chopra neither of them acknowledge Mahesh Yogi too often these days, because they are great global gurus in their own right. So I'm not saying that they are forgetting the debt to their guru, but they don't mention them too often. So they have become a guru on their own. They might not be meaning to insult Mahesh Yogi's memory in any way, but that's how it goes.
Okay, so what are your impressions of TM, and have you ever tried Mahesh Yogi's transcendental meditation? And if yes, how was it?
Well, I had a lot of curiosity, but I haven't personally tried TM. The thing is that I used to be in the UK for some time. In the UK, it was quite expensive. It went into hundreds of pounds. So I thought, well, it's a bit strange that as an Indian, I should start learning TM in the UK and pay hundreds of pounds. But on an India trip, I said, let me try and learn it in India. So I Googled, I searched, and I found somebody somewhere in South Delhi, Safdarjung Enclave, who claimed to be a TM instructor. And I spoke to him also. But then he said, okay, I will teach you TM, and since you are an Indian citizen, we will charge you a much lower rate. But you have to get me flowers, you have to get me, some customary offerings. And it seemed to me that I would have to treat him for a while just as a guru. Now that is something that went against my grain, because I don't believe in rituals, meaningless rituals. So the idea of offering somebody flowers, somebody whom I didn't know, didn't appeal to me. The money was not so much of an issue, but then I said, no, I'm not going to do this. Having said that, my own experience, I didn't have an experience at all with TM, so I don't want to say that it's not anything good. Maybe I should have taken the plunge, given him the flowers and the coconut and whatever other things he wanted. But eventually I didn't do it. But having said that, there are hundreds and thousands of people who believe in TM. It hasn't caught on in India. When I was in India, I had to search to find a TM center. But if you are in the UK, and you'll be going soon enough, if you're in the UK, I am sure you'll find at least 40-50 centers in the UK. But they're going to be charging you maybe £1,100, which is a lot of money for a student. And I'm not sure if I would advise you to invest in it. I want to be fair. And to be fair, I have to say that there are people who say that TM has transformed their lives. You have the American filmmaker David Lynch, who's made these classic films. Mulholland Drive was one of my favorites, but he's made other masterpieces. He's a great believer in TM, and he has opened a center of his own, in which he feels that TM, contributed a lot to his own creativity, his own peace of mind, and so he wants other people to also benefit. There are other people. For example, the singer Pink endorses TM, says a great thing. Then there's the globally famous celebrity host Ellen. She says, transcendental meditation, it works for her. So I would not be dismissive about these people. They have experienced some benefits. I never, went for the course. So it's not fair for me to say that TM is just fooling people or it doesn't work.
So how would you compare Mahesh Yogi's two disciples, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar and Deepak Chopra?
In a way, they seem to have divided territory, because Sri Sri Ravi Shankar is a global guru, but his fiefdom is really in India. So People love him in India. In the South, he has a following of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And he's also respected overseas. There are centers in the US, there are centers in Europe. But he is, I would say, more dominant in India than in the West. So the exact reverse is true for Deepak Chopra. Deepak Chopra has the Chopra Foundation, which is headquartered somewhere in California. So he is a global player. His books have been bestsellers, even on the New York Times. So he has all these books, and he gives talks. He appears on chat shows. So the Americans know him very well. He's highly regarded as a mystic, as a meditator. But in India, there's not so much knowledge about him. Of course, his books are available here also. Some years ago, he came and he gave a talk, but it was a ticketed talk. I think it was 2,000 rupees a ticket. One of my friends went for it. He wasn't sufficiently impressed. He felt, of course, in India, 2,000 rupees is a lot of money to pay and listen to somebody speak. But curiosity level was high. But I don't think in India he has that kind of reputation. Plus, of course, his presentation is different. He is mostly dressed in a business suit, where Siri is different. So the business suit works in America, but it would not work so well in India. So, yeah, as I said, they seem to have divided territory.
All right, and how would you compare Mahesh Yogi and Osho?
Well, in terms of profound discourses, Mahesh Yogi cannot hold a candle to Osho. There is no comparison at all. Osho spoke on a range of topics. The breadth of his knowledge, the depth of his insights, the range of the topics he covered, Mahesh Yogi cannot compare. However, in favor of Mahesh Yogi, it has to be said that he left behind two important disciples who are global players in the Guru world, whatever you might think of them. And I have regard for Deepak Chopra, I have great regard for Sri Ravi Shankar. So Mahesh Yogi left behind a legacy. Osho spoke of the importance of transforming people. In many of his talks, he talks about how it's so important to transform people. He speaks of the Buddha and how the Buddha left behind Bodhidharma, Mahakashyap, took Buddhism further eastward to China, to other places in Southeast Asia. But Osho did not leave anybody particularly profound behind. There is no Osho disciple of global standing. So in that sense, you might say that although Osho's discourses were very profound, but he didn't leave behind a physical legacy in the form of a male or female disciple who could take his work forward. I believe that the real Guru wishes for his disciples to go even further than he has himself gone. So it must count for a failure on the part of Osho that he could not transform somebody who could really carry forward his own legacy.
So coming back to Mahesh Yogi and transcendental meditation, TM never became popularized in India.
That's true. But in a way, it could not have become, because the idea of meditation, as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, has existed in India for thousands of years. So there was nothing new. I mean, the meditation already existed in this land. There were so many people, so many gurus, different gurus who spoke about it. In the West, it was a novelty. So in that sense, it wasn't surprising that TM grew by leaps and bounds in the West, but it could not find a foothold here, because Mahesh Yogi was not offering anything new to Indians. We all knew about meditation in our houses, through our parents, through our grandparents. There was nothing new. But it was a contribution that he took this idea to the West. As far as TM itself is concerned, Osho critiqued it. Osho said, it's nonsense. It's just giving somebody a mantra and they repeat the mantra. It doesn't really matter what it is. Jiddu Krishnamurti went further. He was furious. He had great stature and reputation in the world, and he said transcendental meditation is a scam. It's nothing but a money-making scam. He hated it. But Jiddu also hated the idea of gurus. So Osho and Jiddu, they critiqued it, but I would not accept that they were absolutely right, because as I mentioned, David Lynch, Pink, Ellen, there are so many other people, they swear by it. If it works for somebody, it works for them. I might say that this chocolate cake is terrible, you might like it. So if somebody likes it, somebody is helped because of it, it can't be entirely negated. Having said that, I believe that there are some valid criticisms that have been made of TM.
Okay, that's interesting. Such as?
Well, the first criticism of TM is that it's too commercial, and that is taking Krishnamurti's argument forward. You have to pay hundreds of pounds. You might spend 900 pounds or 1,000 pounds for a short course of running into 3 or 4 days. That's a lot of money. And the second criticism is that once you go for the course, you are not supposed to tell anybody else what happened during the course. So in a way, it's a kind of a marketing thing, because if you tell somebody what you experienced at the TM course, then two things can happen. First thing is that they might say, oh, this is all there is to it. They just give you a mantra and you repeat the mantra. Why should I spend hundreds of pounds? So that's a possibility, and it could be a reason why people were told that whatever happens, whatever you learn here, you cannot share exactly what happens. I think if you have a great meditation technique, you should share it. Genuine spirituality is about sharing spiritual knowledge. So if you have something, why don't you share it? Why do you say you cannot share it? So that's something which Sri Sri also, actually, because his guru was Mahesh Yogi, when he started his Basic Art of Living course, there also people who went for the course, they had to sign a form that they're not going to tell other people what happened in this course. So again, if the Basic Art of Living course is teaching something valuable, what's the problem in sharing it? So these are, I think, some valid criticisms, but the criticisms are not sharp enough, or I would say strong enough, to deny the value of the courses itself. And to be fair, the TM people make a counter argument. They say this 900 pounds which we charge you, it's a one-time payment and gives you lifetime access to TM centers around the world. The second argument is they say that we have these instructors. Who's going to pay their salary? How are we going to get the money? So we need to have a system that allows for payment of an allowance, a decent living wage to these instructors. So we need to charge this money. And they also defend the fact that you shouldn't share it, because they say that, oh, you know, somebody might share it and actually not communicate its proper essence. So we don't want to share it because somebody might share it improperly. I won't go into how valid these arguments are, but they are arguments nonetheless.
And what about discourses? If you compare Mahesh Yogi or Sri Sri Ravi Shankar with Osho?
There is no comparison. Whether it's Sri Sri, Mahesh Yogi's disciple, whether it's the guru or the disciple, as far as discourses are concerned, they cannot hold a candle to Osho.
Osho is no longer with us, but now we have Sadhguru. Would you say that Sadhguru's discourses are as good as Osho's?
Well, you know, Sadhguru, some of his discourses are really brilliant. And I have to say that in sometimes he even displays a practical intelligence which Osho didn't show. So he's wonderful. But by and large, I think Sadhguru doesn't match up to Osho. Because Osho displays such out-of-the-box thinking. And the other thing is that Osho was knowledgeable not only about Indian culture and Indian religion, but he speaks on Christianity, he speaks on Judaism, he speaks on Taoism, he speaks on Confucianism. So the range of the subjects he covers is just awesome. In that sense, I think Osho's discourses are at a higher level. Not to say that Sadhguru isn't brilliant, But for example, Sadhguru, sometimes he will keep saying during the course of his discourses, he'll say, isn't it so? Isn't it so? So it's very sincere and meaningful in one way, because he's really trying to make sure that the student or the disciple is understanding. But in the West, it would be considered to be patronizing. What do you mean, isn't it so? I can use my own brain. So Westerners will not like this, isn't this so? Indians are okay. But that's because Indians don't have sufficient critical thinking. There's this other lady also, Shivani. She also keeps saying, isn't it so, during the course of her discourses. And she also has millions of followers. So I think Osho is better.
So coming back to Osho, have you tried any of his meditations?
No, I haven't. Although I have heard great praise of the meditations from Osho's devotees, all followers. The thing is that Osho spoke about 112 meditations, for example, which are mentioned in an ancient Hindu treatise, Vigyan Bhairav Tantra. So there are 112 techniques of meditation mentioned, and Osho speaks about them. But on the one hand, he speaks about all these, different meditations, but he doesn't give one technique which is so outstanding, which can cover everybody. So he didn't have a great meditation technique that he left behind. There's a kind of inconsistency.
What inconsistency?
Yeah, because if you listen to Osho's talks, he keeps saying, my talks are not important. What I'm saying is not important. What is really important is meditation. Do your meditation. But you have thousands of people, or even hundreds of thousands of people, who will listen to Osho. They are hooked on to his discourses. They will listen to him every day. But none of them, or very few of them, will be practicing meditation. So that's a kind of great inconsistency that Osho himself says, my discourses are not important. What is important is meditation. But his followers, they are listening to him, but they are not doing meditation, because he hasn't left behind any great meditation centers. So if you Google, you'll find the Osho Foundation is there in Pune and in other places, but there's no comparison between TM, which has so many hundreds of centers, or between Vipassana, which has also hundreds, if not thousands of centers. So you don't have so many Osho meditation centers. So that's a kind of a contradiction.
On the other hand, Osho gave people options. So, one meditation technique might not work for everybody. So he gave people options to try different techniques, right?
That is absolutely correct, Ananya. I mean, TM may not work for everybody. Many people say TM is useless. It's true that it works for David Lynch. It works for a few other people, or maybe many other people, but it's not working for everybody. So Osho, in a way, is a kind of homeopathic solution. He's giving 112 techniques which are there in the ancient scriptures. He's also created some techniques of his own. But the thing is that none of these techniques have really taken off. Yeah, I remember with regard to TM, actually TM is mocked in one of Woody Allen's films. There's a Hollywood actor who's calling somebody on the phone in great anxiety, and he says, I've forgotten my mantra. So it's, a kind of, he's in panic because he's forgotten the mantra. With the TM has the mantra. Or there's somebody going into a hall and saying, oh, the Maharishi has come, and I want to touch the hem of his garment. And Woody Allen says, well, the garment must be worth millions then if you, so desperate to touch his hem. So these critiques are there.
Okay, but you gave Osho a score of 70 out of 100. So I'm pretty sure there are some flaws that you see too. What are those?
There are a few negatives that I see about Osho, despite his great erudition and brilliance, his out-of-box thinking. One of the things which I feel is that Osho, he was very much against conventional morality. He was very much against putting people in uniform. He wanted people to express their individuality. But as far as his own disciples are concerned, he wanted them all to wear pre-approved shades of orange. So as far as I think, when I listen to Osho's discourses, I think that even if a man comes wearing a skirt which is multicolored, Osho should accept him as somebody who wants to be a disciple or to be a follower. So why did Osho insist that all his disciples, they should wear orange robes, and they should be also pre-approved orange robes? That's a bit of a contradiction. The second thing is that Osho says that his followers, the people who follow him, are among the happiest people on the planet. This was not my personal experience, because many years ago I went to Pune to try and listen to Osho. So I went to the ashram. I finally could not meet Osho, unfortunately, but I saw many of the disciples. They looked disconnected. They didn't look particularly happy. And on a second occasion also I went. So I think this was just PR on the part of Osho, that my people are among the happiest in the planet. That is not true.
Is it possible that all this meditation business is fake? Something like emperor's new clothes?
I don't think so. You know, there's much validation even from the scientific community. Time magazine created a big article. They had a big article where they covered meditation, and they interviewed hundreds of doctors who said, yes, it works. It lowers your blood pressure. It's good for your health. And there's a great demand for it. There are, as I mentioned, hundreds of TM centers across the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of Vipassana meditation centers also, and I think more than 90 countries. So there's a great demand for meditation, and is there in all our ancient religions. So to say that it's fake, I don't think that's the case. I think it's a great, great contribution. Of course, I'll agree that there is fakery practiced in the name of meditation.
Why do you think there is so much of demand for meditation? Because people are ready to spend hundreds of pounds altogether to learn meditation.
Of course, one shouldn't generalize, but we are living in a time and age of high stress. So the stress is so much that people are willing to pay hundreds of pounds to go and learn some TM. Vipassana doesn't charge money, but people sometimes have to catch a flight or travel to a Vipassana center, and there are other associated expenses. So people will go. There are hundreds of centers in more than 90 countries, and they want to learn meditation. It's a way of managing your stress.
Since we started talking about Mahesh Yogi first, all his contributions and brilliance apart, do you think there are some negatives about him as well?
Yeah, I think Mahesh Yogi, firstly, one of the limitations was that he didn't have a great physical personality. I mean, he looked like a cat, a very attractive cat, but he was small-sized. In that sense, his two disciples, they have better physical personalities. Of course, Siri wears these robes and he has this long flowing hair, and Deepak Chopra also has a powerful business suit kind of personality. But that's a small thing. I think although it affects people. The other thing is that Mahesh Yogi's group, they had some really fantastic and impractical ideas. So their idea of creating world peace, for example, was that all the people, 1,000 people, should sit together and meditate collectively. And they actually genuinely believe that if 1,000 people practice TM sitting together, they are going to generate such vibrations that there's going to be peace on the planet. So I think meditation is a great thing for a person individually, but I believe it's ridiculous to think that 1,000 people or even 10,000 people meditating, that is going to stop the wars in Iraq, in the Middle East, stop the Taliban from creating bomb blasts in Afghanistan. For me, that's all nonsense. So those were some impractical, unfounded ideas. You can say is part of the limitations of the Mahesh Yogi guru business.
What about Sri Sri Ravi Shankar? He is also a world-renowned guru. What are his contributions?
Well, Siri, in some sense, he fell in line with his guru. So he created this basic art of living course, and then there was the advanced art of living course. As I mentioned, you were made to sign a declaration that you can't transmit this knowledge. So the basic art and living course which I attended, I hope I'm not going to get sued for this because I'm not supposed to share, but anyhow, it was good. But it culminated in a yoga exercise known as the Sudarshan Kriya. The yoga exercise itself was very good, but sometimes people confuse yoga with deep spirituality. I think yoga is a way to become silent, but yoga itself is not true spirituality. It is just the outer dimension of spirituality that you get composed,
Did you ever have a chance to meet Sri Sri?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. He came to a house in Sector 37 where I live, in some army officer's house, and I went with an army colonel. We said, let's go and see what he has to offer. We were very curious. So we went to meet him, and we went in. It was on the second floor. I could hear the disciples quarreling between themselves. There was some North Indian lobby, some South Indian lobby. The disciples were, quarreling. And then Siri was sitting somewhere. He looked very tired. He'd come from a long journey. And he was holding a flower in his hand with a long stem. And as people came and they touched his feet, he would, hit people with the flower. So it was interesting, but it was nothing very much. Not that I'm saying that much could have been expected from that. I have to say also that the army colonel with whom I went, he was a bit disappointed because Siri has a kind of feminine presence. So as an army officer, he wants some guru who is a little more, solid. But Siri is very popular among the women. And part of the reason I think he's popular is because he has this softer, gentle vibe which he gives out. So even among the disciples who were gathered, there were 70% I think were women. Not to say that he doesn't have anything of great value to offer. I'm sure he's contributing a lot. Yes, I did meet Siri.
So how would you compare the discourses of Osho and Sadhguru?
Ananya, both have great wisdom. This is something common in Sadhguru and Osho. I would say in some ways Sadhguru has a greater practical intelligence. Osho sometimes he didn't realize the practical implications of things he was saying. He loved to shock and provoke. So, but at the same time, Osho could speak on a variety of topics. His range was incredible. Osho, when he spoke on Christianity, there were Christian priests who said, we haven't heard anybody speak of the Bible so profoundly. And this man is not even, somebody who's been raised in the Christian tradition. You have Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh thought of himself as an authority on Sikhism. He said, my name is the prominent name that is mentioned in the Encyclopedia Britannica for anything referred to in Sikhism. If there are 30 entries, 25 refer to me. So he says, I thought I know more about Sikhism than anybody else. But he went to attend a discourse given by Osho on Japji. And he was awestruck. He said, oh my God, the way Osho interpreted this sacred Sikh text, it never occurred to me to interpret it like that. So that way the range of the man was incredible. But Sadhguru has a response when you ask him about Osho.
That's interesting. What did he say?
He said Osho is the master of controversy. So I think he said it lovingly but also playfully and a bit critically.
Sadhguru calls Osho the master of controversies. Do you think he's right?
I think he's right. Osho quoted controversy even when he didn't need to. He just loved to shock and provoke. But on the other hand, it could be said that sometimes Sadhguru needs to quote controversy, but he doesn't.
You say Osho quoted controversies needlessly sometimes. Can you give us an example of the same?
Well, I'll give you two examples, and also I will reference here why I say that Sadhguru sometimes has greater practical intelligence. During the course of one interview, Osho was asked as to why there are no poor people who are coming there, and why his presentation style was not that of somebody who's just living very simply. And he said, my religion is not for the poor. The poor just have to worry about dal roti. My religion is for the rich. Now when he said that, Osho loved to shock and provoke. So he'd love to say something controversial. But he alienated a lot of people. In fact, what he was saying was not true, because most of his disciples, the Western disciples, they were not particularly rich. They were from lower middle class or middle class families. Yes, relative to Indians, they were rich because they were getting their salaries in pounds or euros or dollars. So it wasn't really even true. But he just wanted to shock. And then when he was in Oregon, he had these 26 Rolls Royces. And so people asked him, why do you need 26 Rolls Royces? And he said, well, I want to shock people because this is good publicity because they'll be drawn to me. They will hate me in the beginning and then they will start loving me when they realize what I have to teach. But I think he didn't realize, practically speaking, that he could alienate so many people, that these would be things that would go against him. And sometimes I meet people today who are very critical of Osho, and two of the things that are there in their mind are, I am the rich man's guru, the poor, they have nothing to do with spirituality. And the second is this Rolls Royce example. So I think this is needless controversy. Osho was a very wise man, and he said many profound things, but I would say that Osho also said some foolish things at times.
Osho and foolish? What foolish things did he say?
Well, that's why I said at the beginning of our discussion today that don't expect that the Guru will have answers to all your questions. This is what people tend to do. They just have blind faith. Keep your critical mindset on. Even the Guru can make mistakes. For example, Osho said that 1/3 of the world's population is going to die of AIDS. In one discourse, he says that never make predictions, which was a very wise statement because nobody knows what the future is going to throw up. But then he contradicted himself and he made this prediction that 1/3 of the world's population is going to die of AIDS, which never happened. Then he said anybody who is suffering from AIDS should be segregated. This was also against all WHO guidelines, conventional medical opinion, which said that this is just going to drive the disease underground. It doesn't help to segregate people. It's also very violative of people's human rights to segregate them. Now, you might be a very wise person, but these are, things which people study, they do research, you need to defer to medical opinion. So Osho's suggestion that people should be segregated if they are HIV, it was not a very helpful suggestion. Then Osho, despite his great wisdom and out-of-the-box thinking, he was very much against what he considered to be sexual deviance. So he was against homosexuality, he was against lesbianism. And he felt that his tolerance, he was a very tolerant man, but somehow his tolerance didn't extend to the fact that different people could have different sexual orientations. And this has existed in our planet for thousands of years. So these were a few of the things. There's one more thing I should mention, and that is Osho was against the family. So he mentioned that there should be a commune. But the commune which he founded, the children later on, they were interviewed on some channels and they said it was a terrible thing for them. They were not connected to their parents. So these are some of the criticisms. So Osho was not wrong about the challenges of monogamy, the challenges of marriage, but the alternative that he presented, that of the commune, that was not really anything new, and it was not really something special. The commune had been suggested by communists hundreds of years earlier. So Osho was not suggesting anything new. Some of the children in these communes, when they grew up, they said, we were just left. We didn't know where our parents were. Nobody took care of us. So the commune system, he didn't have a particularly original idea. So in that sense, again I say that he lacked a certain kind of practical intelligence, a man of great wisdom, but everybody cannot, do everything. I'd also like to mention at least two discourses where he contradicted himself. In one of his early discourses, he says women are the most creative of the two sexes because they give birth to children. And giving birth to a child is the most creative act that's possible. So, many people listened to that. The women were pleased that, okay, women are more creative than men because they give birth to children. But a few years down the line, he said, there's nothing creative about giving birth to children. It's just a biological thing. Why? What are you doing? It's just, the sperm is going into the ova and children are coming out. It's nothing creative at all. Anybody can produce children. They just need a biology. So he contradicted himself. People said, but earlier you used to say this. So he got upset and he said, oh well, forget what I said earlier. The same way, I think another contradiction that I remember is that at one point somebody asked him that we need to really wear these orange robes. And he said, no, you don't have to wear them. Wear anything. I never said that you have to wear orange robes. Then actually people took him for his word And then they started just dressing up like anything, wearing normal green, black, yellow shirts and trousers. But then he got upset, and he said, and he showed that he was upset, so then people realized that he didn't really mean it. So there were these kind of contradictions sometimes that came up in his discourses as well. That is not in any way to say that he was not a great, wise man with wonderful thoughts, with deep spiritual and philosophical insights.
So how can you rate all the gurus as 70% good and 30% bad? I mean, how are they all at the same rank?
Well, within these four, I don't want to give them a comparative ranking because I think it will be unfair. But I think all of them, they are 70. They don't go above 70. And I think we should maintain a critical mindset. The great Buddha said, do not believe anything just because I say so, And Buddha is saying these, but these people, these four gurus we are talking about, they don't say this. So for that reason alone, I think they don't deserve more than 70%.
You even said that Sadhguru doesn't quote a controversy even if there is a need to do so.
Yes. For example, there was a talk on Sabrimala. I heard Sadhguru give a discourse in some auditorium where a boy asked him a question. He said, in the context of the Sabrimala temple controversy, he said, men and women are supposed to be equal. Why should women not be allowed to enter the temple? And our constitution, men and women are equal, and the women should also be allowed to enter the temple. So I think Sadhguru's answer was not very fair. He said that there are some forces which are not good for women, and that's why some cosmic or spiritual forces which are not good for women, and that's why they should not enter. So then the boy asked a follow-up question that why is it that only women are going to get these, bad negative forces? Why don't we have temples where women can go and men cannot go? So I think Sadhguru was not completely fair. He became critical of the boy and he said that, actually you may not realize that I knew that your question is going to come from a certain part of the auditorium even before you asked the question. So I think that was unfair on Sadhguru's part. So personally on the Sabrimala issue, I feel that there might have been a custom, but we should go ahead and go further from the custom. We don't have to stick to custom in all cases. Let the women enter. So there is a great paradox, because I feel enlightened Hindu leadership should have been suggesting that women should be allowed to enter the temple. Instead of that, you have the atheist communists who are suggesting that women should, they have their own agenda. So I'm not saying that the communists are doing this just out of the goodness of their heart. But I feel that we need reform in India. We need reform in Hinduism also. There are lots and lots of temples. There's a temple which is just 30 feet away from my home which says that menstruating women cannot enter. And there are thousands of such temples across the country. So when you speak of the Sabrimala temple issue, you should see this in a wider context. That there may be customs in hundreds or thousands of temples which don't allow women to enter when they are in a particular state. Why should that be allowed to exist? So Sadhguru should have spoken out against those customs and then said, okay, if in this case I believe let's continue with the custom, that still have been acceptable. So I think he was a bit harsh with this boy, but there's a reason why Sadhguru does that.
Why do you think that Sadhguru supported the government?
The communists have been very critical of Sadhguru, and they have been critical of him in a very unfair manner. For example, Hindu newspaper, they invited Sadhguru, come and give us a talk on environment, because Sadhguru has tried to help do things for the environment. But you have Ramchandra Guha, the leftist historian on Gandhi, who said, oh, why have they called Sadhguru? Sadhguru is damaging the environment. There are other people like Swara Bhaskar, who says Sadhguru is a violent man. So he's received attacks from the left, from the communists. So in a way, I think I can understand Sadhguru's position that he cannot sort of support a stand taken by people who are saying such nasty things about him. So it becomes difficult for him.
Sadhguru is not against the family, unlike Osho.
Yes. Well, Sadhguru himself had a family. He has a daughter who you can see on YouTube in one of the videos. So he obviously could not have been against the family. The other thing, difference between Osho and Sadhguru is that Osho spoke out against environmental degradation, about what's happening to the Himalayas, but he said, I'm not going to do anything about it. So he says, my job is to transform the individual, and then the individual can do whatever they want to do about saving the planet. But Sadhguru has demonstrated greater activism. He's spoken about the need to conserve our rivers. I mean, he's made an effort also, a bona fide effort, even if it didn't work out. So he's tried to engage with the environment and also with welfare schemes. So in that sense, he's different from Osho.
You gave all these gurus 7 out of 10, and Sadhguru and Osho are enlightened men. You still gave them 7 out of 10 only?
Ananya, sometimes we get impressed by a teacher, we think this is the best teacher, this is the best professor that's possible. So sometimes people might have been listening to Osho, to Raman Maharishi, to Sadhguru, and they say, oh, my guru, he's the best. There can't be a guru better than this. But that is, you're suspending your critical thinking. The Buddha says, don't believe anything just because I've said so. The Buddha is saying that. So these gurus are, with due respect to them, they cannot compare with the Buddha. So, and the greatest, the other thing is that I believe that the greatest gurus have yet to come. If people listen to this talk 20 years from now, they'll say, oh my God, Mr. Talwar was right. These gurus who have now come, they outclass the previous gurus. So I do believe we are on the brink of great cultural and spiritual revival. And the gurus who are going to come in the future, they are going to be yet greater. So we see awesome gurus and we say, well, there can't be anything better than this. But there is something better. There can be something better possible. The person who gave and you say that, Sadhguru and Osho, they claim to be enlightened. The person who gave the world the idea of enlightenment was the Buddha. And I would give Lord Buddha also 9.5 out of 10.
You would rate Buddha 9 out of 10. So how can someone like you rate him?
Well, in the West, one of the good things that is practiced by the universities is that the students rate the professors. It doesn't mean that the students are better than the professors, but they can rate them and see what they got from them. And the great thing is the Buddha himself says, don't follow me just because, I'm the Buddha. Don't believe anything I've said just because I'm saying it. Use your critical thinking. Think of it, then only accept. That will be a genuine belief, not that you're just following me, blindfolded. So when the Buddha is saying that, do you think the Buddha was lying? Or he was telling an untruth? The Buddha was being completely sincere, That is the hallmark of the greatest people who have walked the planet. They say, don't follow me just because I'm saying that. So I think the Buddha would not be unhappy with me when I say that I would give him 9.5 out of 10. I am nobody to rate the Buddha, that is true. But the student can rate the professor. The disciple can rate the master. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
So you gave Buddha the score of 9 or 9.5 out of 10. So can you tell us what is that flaw which prohibits you to give him a perfect score?
Well, maybe next time we can speak of Buddhism and the limitations of Buddhism, but today's session had been long enough.
So that was it for today. I'm pretty sure that I learned something new and interesting, and maybe you did too. Stay tuned with us because we'll be back with yet another episode very soon.
Thank you, Ananya. It's good to be with you and your team. It's wonderful. I think we had a very long episode today, but hopefully it was rewarding to our viewers. And see you again in a few days, and we'll talk about something else. Maybe we talk about meditation.